Hello and welcome to this tutorial series on the Arturia's emulation of the Yamaha CS-80, another classic synthesizer, this time from 1977. And you don't see many of these things, although you will be pretty familiar with it from the likes of, much of Vangelis's work in the 70s and 80s, Blade Runner, Chariots of Fire. It appears on Billie Jean by Michael Jackson, Oxygen by Jean-Michel Jarre, an absolutely iconic instrument that's regarded as one of the best analog synthesizers of all time. And part of the reason it has such a hefty reputation is because it's incredibly musical. The way the oscillators interact and the options you have, the flexibility that you have as a performance instrument are immense. But it can be a little bit difficult to get this one under your fingers. It's not the most intuitive instrument to understand, even though it doesn't have the complexity of something like a modular synth. There is a lot to understand, and the interface has its issues. We'll get to those as we go, but as always, we're going to break it down module by module. And today, as is almost always the case with every synthesizer, you start with your oscillators. You want to know how the synthesizer fundamentally generates sound, and in order to do that, you need to go to the oscillators. Now, I've built this default patch, which is slightly different from the one that comes out of the box, although if you go to your template folder and select default, that's where you start. I've then subsequently edited this thing to get it really pared down to the absolute bare minimum sound that you can possibly imagine, and I've saved that as my own preset. And out of the box, it generates a Sawtooth wave. Really straightforward, any number of synths can do this. So let's figure out how the oscillator actually works. Well, firstly, when I say oscillator, there are two, and don't be overwhelmed by the number of sliders up here. This is basically two oscillators completely replicated, and you can see that they're a mirror image. Here's oscillator 1 at the top, and here's oscillator 2 underneath, and you can see that they are actually a mirror image. So in the case of like the LPF buttons, they're mirrored, and then the HPF and then the 24 dB buttons. So we're just going to deal with oscillator 1 today. And one of the problems that I've got with this instrument is the buttons are really difficult to figure out what's going on. You don't know whether or not up is on or down is on, or whether or not it's a 2-state button or a 3-state button. And even the graphical interface is a little bit tricky to actually figure out what's going on. If I make this thing huge, and we have a look at this button here, when you really zoom in, if you've got a massive monitor, it's actually much easier to tell that this button is flat at the top and now it's flat at the bottom. And you can see that there's a tiny reflection of the symbol on the flat face of the back of the button, which is really cute. But when you're dealing with it in like normal person mode, those things are a little bit difficult to see. And as you'll see in various stages of this tutorial, it's not completely obvious which way round these buttons are supposed to be in order to attain the effect that you want. You just got to learn this stuff. So if I click both of these buttons so that they're flat at the top and press a key, I get no sound. Okay, there is no waveform being generated by the oscillator. This button here that has the triangle and the sawtooth pictures on is actually a 3-state button. At the moment it's in top flat, which is off. Then if I click it, it's now in a middle toggle state. Okay, let's just go big. That's in a central toggle position, and that's generating a triangle wave. And then if I press it again, it goes to bottom flat. So I've now pressed the button so that it's flat at the bottom. And now we're generating a sawtooth. Off, triangle, saw. This button over here, turn that one off, is the square wave generator. So no sound, square wave sound. And these two things can be combined. So now we're going to get a square wave and a triangle wave. There, effectively, the triangle's kind of being masked by the square wave, but it is there. If I make it a sawtooth instead, you'll hear those two things. Turn the square off, just got the saw, turn the square back on, got square and saw. In addition to being able to generate squares, triangles and saws, it can also make a sine wave. But the sine wave isn't over here, it's here, incredibly. So again, let's turn both of these off. Okay, you can hear me hitting the key there. Sine wave. Now the reason the sine wave's over here and square, triangle and saw are over here is because a sine wave is never affected by filtering. You can't filter a sine wave. It's a single harmonic. So there's no concept of removing upper frequencies or doing anything with your lower frequencies or anything at all. So it's a very musical concept, but a little bit weird to wrap your head around because that's not how synths normally work. So the filter section, which is here and which we'll deal with in the next tutorial, is essentially bypassed if you have a square, if you have a sine wave. It's not affected by any of these buttons whatsoever. Again, just dealing with oscillator 1 here, we can generate 3 different waveforms simultaneously with the same oscillator. What you're hearing there is a square, a triangle actually. Let's make it a sawtooth. Square, saw and sine all simultaneously. I've just this minute noticed that my default preset had this button pressed down, but it doesn't actually have any effect on the tone, so let's just ignore that for now. As I say, we're not dealing with the filter today. Okay, turned all my waves off again, so I've got nothing. Let's turn the square wave on. Okay, the square and triangle waves are both capable of having pulse width modulation applied to them. A triangle wave is very similar to a square wave. They've both got odd harmonics, only odd harmonics. The triangle wave has the frequencies are attenuated the further away you get from the fundamental. Let's not worry about that. Essentially, they are both very similar and they can both have pulse width modulation applied to them. And in fact, that's how it works here. So we've got the square wave, and these controls over here allow us to control the pulse of the wave. So if I increase the speed of the pulse width modulation effect to basically once every second and start increasing this slider, you can hear the width of the pulse being changed, and it's basically having a filtering effect. Essentially, it's not changing the pitch of the tone, it's changing the colour of the tone, the types of harmonics that are being generated, the shape and sound of the wave. We can turn off the modulation effect and just affect the width of the pulse itself. That's a 10 or 90% pulse width, they're the same thing. So you see it says 0.1 on the pop-up box, but 90% at the top of the slider. They're the same thing. Notice that again, the pop-up only says 0.48 and on the legend it says 50%. So that's essentially a true square wave, and then we get a thinner and thinner pulse wave being dialed in. That in turn can then be modulated using an oscillator. So this is the speed of the oscillator, this is the depth. So that's the square wave being modulated, having its pulse width modulated. Let's turn that off and bring the triangle in. And there you go, you can hear that that's modulating as well. Triangles are softer than square waves because they've got some of those higher frequencies attenuated, but fundamentally they are still odd harmonic based waveforms. So we get the same general feel, it's just softer. Now all of that was applying a sine wave modulation effect to the pulse width, but it doesn't have to be. It was in the original CS-80, but we've got additional options here in the VST. If we switch to a sawtooth wave now, we're going to apply a different shape of modulation. You can hear the sharp spike of the sawtooth. There you can hear it sweeping through the harmonic range. All the way up becomes a ramp. Up, and then fall off the cliff. Square, it's going to be an on-off effect. Noise speaks for itself. Just literally distorts the wave. We get less tone because it's being randomized. And random is like, think of it like a sample and hold generator, where it takes a snapshot at a particular frequency, does that for a while, and again we're dealing with the width of the pulse here, and then it'll change to a different, there you go, it's just changed. So it randomly picks new widths to apply, does that for a while, then picks a new width and does that for a while. That's a very similar concept to sample and hold. Now all of this talk to do with pulse width modulation is dealing with an oscillator. The way we're able to get those changes in time is with an LFO, and we have 3 different modes for the LFO. All of that has been in trigger mode, which means every time I hit a key, the note begins to sound at the LFO's start point, and then the wave kicks in and does its thing. So you can hear the sine wave oscillating, but it always starts from the start position. If I send it into free mode, the oscillator is now doing its thing in the background, and when you hit a key, it'll just pick up wherever it happens to be. So you're never guaranteed now to have the trigger point at the start of every note. We won't deal with mono just for now, because that's when you get into dealing with multiple voices, and we're not going to deal with voices just yet, but trust me, we'll come back to mono mode eventually. Let's just leave it in trig for now, which means every time we play a note, the LFO will begin from the beginning. It's the easiest one to understand. In addition to the 3 oscillator types, I've turned them all off again. We have a noise generator, which is just white noise. So it's possible to have 4 different sound sources for this oscillator: square on its own, sine on its own, noise on its own, and then triangle or saw, depending on which option this button is set to. All of those 4 wave types, let's just use the sine wave for now, go into an envelope, and this determines for how long and in what manner the note is played. So at the moment we've got no attack, which means the note is beginning as soon as we press the key at full volume. No decay, which means it's instantly approaching its sustain level, which I've set to maximum. So basically, as soon as I press a key, we hear the full sound of the note, and then as soon as I let go of the key, the release time is set to 10 milliseconds, which is as low as this keyboard can generate. So the sound stops as soon as it possibly can. The envelope itself is set to the maximum level, so we get the full sound. That's where we can change the oscillator's volume. And this is really, really basic stuff. If I increase the release, now when I release the key, we get that little bit of tail. Similarly, if we have a long attack and I hit a key, the note ramps up. If you want to have some effect from your decay, you're going to need something other than a maximum sustain level, because the sustain level is what happens after the decay has expired. Well, the difference between your attack at maximum and your sustain at maximum is nothing. So let's set sustain to something other than maximum. And now we have a tail off during the decay, and then down to a flat sustain level, which will be held as long as the key is pressed down. And then as soon as we let go of the key, we go into our release cycle and the note stops. Get your foundations right, put your building blocks in place, then when you come to start building additional sounds on top, you'll be in a much better position to understand what the hell's going on. That's it for episode 1. In the next episode, we'll deal with the VCF, start bringing in colour to the tone, start getting more interesting sounds. Hope to see you then. Thanks very much for watching.